Let's find and reintegrate the world's third bucket kids, all 500 million of them, within the next few months. Irvin Studin, Global Brief Magazine, and the Institute for 21st Century Questions. In March of 2020, March of last year, the world witnessed not just the onset of the pandemic, but the greatest mass synchronized policy and public administration move in human history. And that is the closure of schools in many, if not most, of the countries of the world. Schools were closed across borders, across continents, across societies and civilizations. Many of them remain closed to this day, and many of them were closed for prolonged periods, opened and then closed once again. In total, the closure of the schools resulted in the third major catastrophe of the pandemic period, and in my humble assessment, the catastrophe with the greatest long-term consequences. That is, alongside of the public health and economic catastrophes of the pandemic, the greatest catastrophe is that of third bucket kids. Third bucket kids numbering in the 500 million range. 500 million third bucket kids in primary and secondary school alike. What's a third bucket kid? We discussed this last time. In March of 2020, most of the kids were in bucket 1. They were in physical or classical school, the one you and I know very well, in which we were schooled, I presume, and which most of our children were schooled. In the advanced countries, we imagine that everyone pivoted immediately to bucket 2, online or virtual schooling. But what seems to have happened in unacceptably and catastrophically high numbers is that a third bucket has been created at scale. And that third bucket is called no school at all. We are not talking about your school dropouts of yesteryear. We are not talking about truants. We are talking about third bucket kids, again, in the 500 million children range. How could this be? How could the closure of bucket 1 have resulted in such a large bucket 3, catastrophically no school at all? Answer: many of these kids had no access to online schooling at all to begin with. 6% in Canada, similar quanta in the United States, higher in Latin America, even higher in South and Southeast Asia, higher in Africa still. But as soon as you go online, all sorts of funny dynamics happen. First, there are abusive homes. Secondly, Savita in Mumbai might have gone and she could have had access to online schooling, but she went back to her village, she got married, or she entered the labor force. There could be poverty dynamics as soon as you're in online school that obtain. A parent is sick, a parent dies. You have many children on one single device, or especially in the advanced countries, the most catastrophic category, a middle to high school level child in online schooling for 2 or 3 months begins to realize or feel that school has no meaning, and he or she simply checks out by turning the screen off. He or she is in the third bucket. Brian was the captain of the soccer team, is all of a sudden in the third bucket, simply by virtue of turning the Zoom screen off, the Zoom call off. Nobody is searching for Brian because everyone is online in quarantine, and Brian is out for 2 years. Between 13 and 15, Brian becomes a very different person, and the non-school dynamic takes over. Brian is going nowhere in life, much like Savita, who is married at 12 or 13 years old, or Rodrigo in Colombia and Argentina, who didn't have access to online to begin with. 90 million in India, 25 million in Pakistan, 20 million, up to 20 million in the United States, 7 million Nepal, 5 million Mexico, 200,000 in my own Canada, 200,000, 100,000 in the United Kingdom, and so on. We quickly get to 500 million when you go across the candidate countries, many of them represented on the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids post-pandemic, which I chair, but which has representation from over 50 countries at terrific levels, and has been working overtime both to analyze this problem, to solve it in praxis on the ground. Now, before we get to how we must solve it in the next few months. We must solve it with a sense of mission urgency. Let me just explain the consequences of non-resolution. First of all, many of these 500 million children will die young. They will die young. This is not accepted in the advanced countries, but it is so. A child without education, this level of preparation, in a world that requires this level of preparation post-pandemic, has little chance. There is little need for him or her post-pandemic. No one is going to accept that person's CV with a grade 8 education, let's be honest, in Canada, the United States, and Europe alike. However, in India and South Asia and parts of Africa and the Middle East, leave aside North America and Europe, if you have massive numbers of children who are just patently undereducated or non-educated, there is little chance of a positive, productive, post-pandemic future. So entire societies will be destabilized post-pandemic in virtue of these third bucket kids that have been created, to be clear, through systems failure. Systems failure not realized by those who, through good intentions alone, closed the schools in March of 2020. Studin's law: thou shalt never close the schools again, ever, unless there's war at our feet. The schools are too central, not just to the education of our children, but in the entire system of a society. We now understand that. As soon as you close them, catastrophe obtains. Now, what's to be done? How do we find and reintegrate these third bucket kids by September, October, November? I turn to this now. To find and reintegrate the world's third bucket kids by September, October, November of this year, the third bucket catastrophe must be absolutely top of mind for all decision makers in the relevant countries. Let me repeat, right alongside of public health and the economy, third bucket kids must be top of mind, whether you're a Minister of Education or the Prime Minister or President, whether you're at the regional, provincial, or state level, or at the national level. We must understand, because we are saving kids' lives, and we are saving our own lives in terms of stabilizing our society. And the time urgency comes from the fact that if we don't get them by this fall or in the coming months, then their position in ouster will consolidate, and they are on a different path. In huge numbers, Oliver Twist's at our feet, created again through a mistake of public administration. Couched in good intentions, but catastrophic still. It is our duty to correct the mistakes. Let us not be sentimental about it. The duty consists, to be clear, in bringing the children back from the third bucket, ideally into the first. Let us not have any illusions about it. The ideal return is to the first bucket, not to the second bucket. But the second bucket is still acceptable. So we return to bucket one or bucket two, physical school or online school. But we know now, after a year and a half, with a lot of not just stories, but empirical evidence and studies and reports, that bucket one is first better pedagogically for the child, and secondly, for our purposes, as we've discussed amply in the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids, less susceptible to ouster. The kids are less likely to be ousted from bucket one than they are from bucket two, for the dynamics we discussed. Bucket two to bucket three, the passage has very, very little exit costs. But from bucket one to bucket three is much more difficult unless we shut again all the schools down for the next emergency, which would breach Studin's law. Thou shalt never again close the schools unless there is war. We must keep the schools open and provide them with oxygen and make them central always. Now we understand that. Now, how do we find and reintegrate these third bucket kids? They are at our feet. We just don't know where they are and who they are in many cases. Many cases because we're still demobilized and emergency mode quarantining. First, all the attendance records at board levels, at school levels, at ministry levels. Secondly, we must go to friends, families, and social networks of the children through trusted authorities and proxy authorities to find out who's in school, who's not in school. Okay? This is alongside of the top line effort rhetorically and politically in social media by governments and leaders. That all should have been done by now. Then there is on-the-ground work that is being done in India and Latin America and parts of the United States, door to door, where necessary. These kids have been out of school for a year and a half, almost 2 years. We need to go and find them and persuade them to come back. Leave aside compulsory schooling laws. This is an exercise in what the Commission has come to emphasize as relationships. Relationships are key. Relationships with the families, with the students, through teachers, through principals, through community leaders, through friends, through soccer coaches, hockey coaches, cricket coaches. Then we must choreograph the return. Once we know the children who need to come back to school in the coming months, we must choreograph the return. The return must be bespoke. It must be tailored to the students and the child's individual circumstances. Different choreography for the child who has yet to begin school, who is grade 1 or 2, ousted still, and the child who is in grade 10, 11, or 12. Ouster as well, but different psychological and material circumstances, different reasons for being out, and different trajectory in life. Keep in mind that if we reintegrate the child at the lower level with speed, he or she may still go on to become a Nobel Prize winner. Same with the older one. But if the older one is not reintegrated, he or she will end up in a bad place, because he or she is undereducated for the world to come, in most cases. For the younger child, there's simply no excuse, but the choreography must still be very, very precise. So choreography. The summertime in the Northern Hemisphere, wintertime right now in the Southern Hemisphere, cannot be wasted. Camps, sports, food programs and food drives, play, all of these things are ways of bringing the children back into the school environment. Many states in the United States are very energetic in this regard. Florida, Arkansas come to mind, Connecticut to some extent. In Latin America, food is being used as a fillip to find the children who need to come back. By the way, these could be rich and poor children alike. Let us not have any presumptions. And then the welcome at the door, with a hug and with a specific academic and social program for the child to be reintegrated with high probability of retention for the long run. Key proviso, thou shalt not embarrass the child. Let us not embarrass the family. Let there not be legal jeopardy for the family who, let's say in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, in certain Indigenous communities, has been kept out of school for a year and a half, but for which the family may be nervous to return the child because there might be some perverse legal circumstance. You return the child, the family's in jeopardy of being disunited or separated at that point, but the child must be in school. Now, the people who must choreograph are obviously people in positions of responsibility, ministry officials, teachers, principals, but it is in the end a human exercise. And the intelligent outcome, the only acceptable outcome, is for the child to be in school. Final point. For this school to work, it cannot be a zombie school. We are not returning the child, as we may see in some parts of my own Canada, to a zombie school in which he or she is being policed for COVID restrictions and for movement, for eating, for distancing. We are returning the child for retention purposes and to pivot post-pandemic to a spirit-full, content-full, energy-full post-pandemic education where they will be retained, no chance of ouster, and where we're preparing them for the post-pandemic world. This means schools that are fun, where the standards are not about health and safety, the standards are about academics and character building and preparation for the future. That must be our mission. It must be all hands on deck in the coming months. Let's be extremely serious about it. See you soon.